Time is running out for Congress to reach a deal on a federal budget and avoid a government shutdown. The deadline to get it passed is just 7 days away. Congress also has yet to approve the Farm Bill extension, and earlier this week, the House passed the National Defense Authorization Act, but it still faces some obstacles in the Senate. For the very latest, we're joined by Congressional reporter at The Hill, Mychael Schnell. Mychael, as always, it's great to see you.
Hello.
You're busy these days.
Oh, yes.
No rest for the weary. Look, let's get right into it. The shutdown deadline, just a week away. Where do negotiations stand right now?
Speaker Johnson told me yesterday that they are very, very close, but we still don't have legislative text, so we still don't know the particulars here. Look, this is pretty mainstream for Congress. They oftentimes wait until right before that deadline to get going. Speaker Johnson did tell me that he predicts that there'll be a Sunday rollout of legislative text so we can actually see, A, how long is a CR going to run, B, what do the disaster relief provisions look like, and C, what are any other type of, extra priorities that are going to maybe try to sneak in there, because this is one of the last must-pass measures of the 118th Congress. So all that goes to say is apparently we're close. That's what Speaker Johnson said yesterday, but we're still waiting to look at legislative text.
So are we looking, and break this down for some laymen in our audience and those of us who aren't running around Capitol like you are we looking at a deal or another CR?
Yeah, so it is a deal on a CR, right? So right now, congressional negotiators are talking and trying to hash out what exactly this continuing resolution will look like. Now, that's not a deal on an omnibus. That's not a deal on the 12 appropriations bills. It's just kicking the can, farther into next year. Now, it is a deal, though, because this is not going to be a partisan or political piece of legislation. It's going to be something that was crafted by lawmakers in both parties and both chambers that will get bipartisan support. But we're still going to have to see another shutdown deadline in probably 3 months. I've been hearing from sources that they're looking at a March deadline. Probably 3 months. We'll have to go right back through this process again.
Right. So kicking the can down the road, some
Absolutely.
might say that. I want to turn to the National Defense Authorization Act, also known as the NDAA. It passed the House earlier this week, but we know that there are several provisions that Democrats aren't happy about. The most contention of those issues are the restrictions on gender-affirming care for military dependents under the age of 18. Is that going to have an impact on how this stands in the Senate?
No. The short answer is no. This was another piece of legislation that was crafted by bipartisan and bicameral negotiators. So folks in both parties, in both chambers, it's going to be bipartisan in the Senate. Now, the NDAA is typically a very bipartisan piece of legislation. Sometimes you'll see some very liberal Democrats and very conservative Republicans who join together and vote against it. But by and large, it's very bipartisan. It may be a little bit more partisan this year in this year's vote because of that transgender provision. Essentially, it says that the military health care that's used for service members, those funds cannot go towards gender-affirming care for individuals under the age of 18. Now, that is something that really frustrated a lot of Democrats, including Adam Smith. He's the top Democrat on the House Armed Services Committee. He actually voted against it, saying that the NDAA is supposed to be a bipartisan measure. Shame on Republicans for arguing and insisting that this has to be in there. But at the end of the day, Democrats don't want to be seen as voting against the military, not being supportive of the men and women overseas. So this will pass with bipartisan support in the Senate next week, but we may see a little bit more Democratic opposition than we normally would.
I want to stay in the Senate. We know that Majority Leader Chuck Schumer says he's bringing a Social Security reform bill to the floor for a vote. Walk us through what's in that bill.
Yeah, that's right. We heard these remarks from Schumer this week, essentially because we're at not just the end of the year, but the end of the 118th Congress. We oftentimes see congressional leaders, try to bring forward any last-minute priorities that we have. We're particularly seeing this with Schumer because he's giving up the title of Majority Leader come into next year because, of course, Democrats lost control of the Senate. So essentially, Schumer said he's going to work hard to try to get this Social Security bill over the finish line. It did pass the House with bipartisan support. If passed, it would repeal the windfall elimination provision and the government pension offset. Essentially, those are rules that backers say have argued that have sparked unfair restrictions and benefits for some individuals who have worked in public service. So that's essentially what we're looking at. Still a lot of questions of how this will happen. Will it be a standalone bill? Will Schumer try to attach this to the NDAA or to the CR? A lot of open questions right now, but the majority leader is pushing for it.
Let's turn to Senators Joe Manchin and Sinema. Oftentimes stirring up some controversy, not necessarily intentionally, but they seem to be burning some bridges on their way out. They're opposing President Biden's appointee to lead the National Labor Relations Board. Why are they voting against these nominees, and how are their colleagues reacting?
Yeah, I would say this is not so out of the ordinary for Joe Manchin and Sinema. You said it yourself. These are folks who have drawn ire of some of their colleagues in recent years because of how they have voted against the grain and against the party sometimes. They both left the Democratic Party to join the Independent Party, to become independents. They've been known for that independent streak in the Senate, and that happened just this week as both of them are on their way out of the Senate voting against this Labor Board nominee. Now, there were a lot of senators who were pretty upset about this. You know, they wanted to get they were trying to solidify President Biden's legacy as much as they can, get his priorities through as much as they can. This was not helpful for that, and they're letting their colleagues know how they feel.
Absolutely. Want to make a quick correction. I said Kristen Sinema. It's Kirsten
Sinema.
Lots of us in Washington oftentimes make that mistake.
Yes.
So just wanted to get that out there. I want to turn to the incoming administration. The two most contentious nominations to President Trump's cabinet that we're watching are Pete Hegseth for the Department of Defense and, of course, Tulsi Gabbard for the Department of, or I should say, Director of National Intelligence. It's interesting. Gabbard seems to really be struggling more on Capitol Hill as Pete Hegseth, his situation sort of turns around for the better for him. We saw, of course, the civil war in Syria seemingly come to an end with the collapse of Bashar al-Assad, someone she met with in 2017. And our colleagues Alex Angitano and Al Weaver are reporting that sources are telling them there's a number of people on Capitol Hill who believe she's not prepared for the job, that there's concern about some of her relationships with some of our adversaries. Do you think there's a chance she'll step aside, or is Trump going to stick by her like he's done so with Hegseth?
So that's going to be the key question, right? We saw Matt Gaetz. He was essentially forced to step aside. There were folks who were saying that they just weren't going to support him. He didn't have a path to that confirmation. Pete Hegseth hung on. You know, it looked like just last week that his nomination was sort of circling the drain. It looked like the writing was on the wall. He stuck with it. President-elect Trump threw his support behind him. We saw Pete Hegseth do this strong media push, and right now his bid is surviving. I mean, I think that Senator Joni Ernst, a Republican from Iowa, who's a lot of folks are keeping an eye on, she said that at the end of the day, at the least of it, Pete Hegseth deserves a hearing. So that's going to be fascinating to see that play out in the new year. But that essentially the way that I read that comment was, okay, Pete Hegseth will be safe from now until the hearing. We'll have to see how things go forward. Now Tulsi Gabbard's getting her time in the spotlight, just as we have seen other nominees. And you're right, as our colleagues did report, there is some skepticism in the room. And this shouldn't come as such a shock because there were already questions about that 2017 trip to visit with Bashar al-Assad. There were questions about her comments on the Russia-Ukraine war. Some of the things that she was said have been sympathetic to Moscow, things that have been mentioned on Russian state media. So there have been these questions in the public sphere. And that's the thing about the confirmation process, the advice and consent process. Senators are now able to go face-to-face with the nominee to ask about these concerns. Sounds like it's not going so well. What will happen? Will Trump, will Trump let her twist in the wind, and will we see her step aside? I think it's still a little premature to tell, but absolutely this is a confirmation to keep an eye on.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr. will be on Capitol Hill next week meeting with lawmakers. It'll be interesting to see maybe how his presence impacts the scrutiny on Tulsi Gabbard. Want to turn our attention to a new AP NORC poll that showed just 3 in 10 Americans are confident in Trump's cabinet picks. That's interesting because if we compare that to another poll released earlier this week, a CNN poll that showed over half say they are happy with how Trump is handling the transition. It seems like folks like Trump, but they don't like his cabinet picks. What's the disconnect there?
I mean, he's got some controversial names up there, right? Tulsi Gabbard, for example. There are some real concerns about her foreign policy background. RFK Jr., there are some real concerns about his vaccine skepticism. Pete Hegseth, there's the sexual assault, there's the excessive drinking, there's his comments saying that women should not serve in combat roles. So I think while a lot of people, admire President-elect Trump, they put him in office, maybe they're raising an eyebrow a little bit about some of these picks. That may be what the disconnect looks like, but I'm interested to see how those numbers trend as we get into early next year. We see the president-elect actually take office, and we see some of these nomination and confirmation hearings, because they're going to be absolutely fascinating.
And worth noting that, Republicans and even a number of Democrats have embraced some of President Trump's other picks. Marco Rubio for state, Elise Stefanik for U.S. ambassador to the UN. So maybe a different, lots of people, a very different array of people up for the cabinet nominations. Mychael, Schnell, as always, thank you.
Thanks, Julia.
The mysterious drone sightings in the sky continued last night without an answer in sight. Connecticut Senator Richard Blumenthal says the drones flying over New Jersey should be taken out if they're flying near military bases or airports, while the White House and the Pentagon say the unidentified drones don't pose any national security risk, adding many of the sightings are just regular aircraft. After several classified briefings for the lawmakers, the drones still remain a mystery. News Nation's Joe Khalil is on Capitol Hill with the latest.
Julie, what we're seeing now is lawmakers, especially those from New York and New Jersey, getting off the sidelines and trying to get into this more directly now because, frankly, they've been really frustrated. They're not getting the information on these drones that they want. They're not hearing from the White House and Homeland Security. For example, newly elected Senator Andy Kim went back to his state and says that he was tagging along with local law enforcement as they were monitoring these sightings in real time. He actually saw them with his own eyes. He recorded some of these drones, posted them to social media, and said, despite what John Kirby at the White House is saying, which is that a lot of these things cannot be corroborated and are often manned aircraft that are just regularly doing their thing legally, Andy Kim says that he and his officers on the ground were looking at flight track apps, and they were seeing that whatever they were looking at in the skies was not sanctioned aircraft. So he was reporting that in real time. You've also got several senators, himself included, along with Cory Booker, Chuck Schumer, and Kirsten Gillibrand, sending a letter directly to Homeland Security, the FBI, and the FAA, demanding that they come in immediately and give these senators a briefing. Whatever they know, these senators want to know as well. You've also got, on the state level, state senators asking Governor Phil Murphy to do more, to demand from the White House that they immediately give New Jersey the resources and the tools they need to respond to this kind of thing. Lawmakers here that we've been talking to all week are now saying there's no reason that the Department of Defense shouldn't be bringing down some of these drones, either shooting them down or bringing them down in other ways. We heard from Josh Gottheimer, Congressman from New Jersey, who said this just this morning. Take a listen.
New Jersey can't become the Wild West of drone activity. No state can become the Wild West of drone activity. And Americans shouldn't have to worry about what's flying unauthorized overhead, especially as technology like AI advances at an unprecedented clip. The FBI should be standing at a podium of the Department of Homeland Security and briefing the public and explaining to them what these drones are.
Now, of course, we did hear from John Kirby at the White House Thursday saying that there's no evidence these things pose any threat to the public, no evidence that these are any foreign adversary of ours. Still, clearly that is not reassuring, not just members of the public who continue to post these videos, but also lawmakers who are continuing to demand answers and demand clarity on what our intelligence officials know about these sightings.
And thank you, Joe Khalil. It was one of President-elect Trump's signature campaign promises this election season: mass deportations of immigrants who were in the country illegally. All told, an estimated 11 million people could potentially be at risk of deportation. Vice President-elect J.D. Vance has proposed to start with 1 million in the first year, but a new report by the Congressional Joint Economic Committee shows that that endeavor could gut the U.S. economy and boost inflation. Joining us now to break down the report is White House reporter Brett Samuels. Brett, as always, thank you so much for joining us. The report shows that somewhere between 4.5% and 5.5% of the labor force is made up of workers who are in the country illegally. Industries like construction, agriculture, and even healthcare and hospitality depend on that kind of a labor. So walk through what the report shows mass deportations could mean for these industries and what impact it could have on the country's bottom line.
Yeah, Julia, I think this report gets at some of the logistical concerns that folks have raised with how this mass deportation plan might actually work and whether President-elect Trump and his team have actually thought through some of the potential consequences. The report gets at, as you mentioned, this possibility that by deporting these workers, it would actually be hitting some major industries quite hard. It would be removing laborers who are really central to, agricultural industries, making sure that crops get out each year, construction industries, other industries that require hard labor often. And these are jobs where, if you take away some of these undocumented workers, it raises the question of who would actually take these jobs to replace them. So certainly that could have a trickle-down effect to raise prices, to potentially lead to supply chain issues. So certainly raising some questions about whether the incoming Trump administration has really, thought through all of the potential ripple effects of their mass deportation plans.
So on that note, do you think this report is likely to make anyone on Team Trump reconsider the proposal, or are they set on implementing this policy, which was a campaign promise?
Yeah, it seems unlikely at this point that they're going to totally back off this mass deportation pledge. I suppose it's possible that they get underway and they run into some issues, or they see potential ripple effects and maybe they change course or adjust, and maybe it's not as sweeping as they had pledged, where, Trump has talked about deporting basically anyone who is in the country illegally. They've talked about starting with folks with criminal records specifically. So maybe they start there and then readjust depending on backlash. But Trump said in an interview with Meet the Press, he talked about wanting folks to come into the country legally, that he doesn't want to totally shut down immigration. The question is, does he deport millions of people and then go back to letting people in legally? Or how does he do it? He also hasn't really spoken about the actual tangible cost, the dollar cost of doing these mass deportations. So certainly a lot of questions around how this will all work and what the consequences might be, but no sign early on that Trump is, just shrugging this off as campaign rhetoric.
Do you expect any members of Congress to step in, and what might that look like? I imagine that a lot of Republicans who hold the majority in the House and the Senate are supportive of this.
Definitely. And we've heard from folks close to Trump and from some Republican lawmakers that they're hoping to put a reconciliation bill to get that through Congress and put it on Trump's desk, potentially as early as the start of February, that would basically beef up border security and address a lot of immigration concerns. So Republicans seem really eager to get moving on immigration reform. Obviously Trump himself is going to act quickly with executive orders on day one. He's already talked about starting mass deportations on day one and signing executive orders to restart border wall construction, and to reimpose some immigration crackdown policies that he had in place when he left office in 2021. So certainly I think we'll see folks moving quickly. And as you mentioned, the question is whether Democrats try to broker some kind of compromise or get involved in talks here, or whether Republicans just get aggressive and try to go it alone on immigration here.
I want to shift gears and talk about Vivek Ramaswamy praising Colorado's governor, Democrat Jared Polis, for repealing and shredding more than 200 executive orders. We know that Ramaswamy is one of the leaders of DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency. Brett, are Democrats warming up to the idea of deregulation? We've seen at least 2 Democrats join the DOGE subcommittee on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, it's really been interesting to watch, as you mentioned, some Democrats try to actually get a foothold in this advisory commission and, sort of extend an olive branch, if you will, to Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, who are leading this effort to cut government regulations, cut government spending. On the one hand, you have folks like Jared Polis, who have had some sort of interesting political views. He obviously praised the RFK Jr. nomination when it first came out and actually got some backlash from Democrats over that. And now we see him, getting praise from Vivek Ramaswamy. But you also have folks on Capitol Hill, like Ro Khanna, for example, folks who are, speaking a little bit more openly about what this DOGE advisory commission is going to try and do. And I think it's a combination of Democrats trying to signal that, they agree and that they want to side with voters, that government maybe regulation has gone too far, government spending has gone too far. And at the same time, I think there's an argument to be made that if you're a Democrat, it makes sense to kind of get a foothold here and have your say and try and nudge the conversation in the direction that you want it to go, rather than just let Musk and Ramaswamy and congressional Republicans just totally steer the ship without any input from Democrats.
So President-elect Trump has invited Chinese President Xi Jinping to inauguration next month. What's the angle here? I mean, I don't think this was on any of our bingo cards, Brett. Is Trump trying to soften the blow of his tariff plan? Is this a negotiating tactic?
Yeah, Julie, it was interesting to see this sort of direct outreach. It's not uncommon for ambassadors, diplomats from foreign countries to attend inaugurations, but for a head of government like President Xi Jinping to attend would be a bit unusual. There is reporting that he's actually declined, that he does not plan to attend. But still, the invitation is interesting because, as you mentioned, Trump has had this sort of hot and cold relationship with President Xi. Obviously, they had this trade war during his first term. Trump was very critical of Xi in the early months of the COVID-19 outbreak that originated in China. At the same time, in more recent weeks, we've heard him, praise Xi. He's called him a brilliant leader. He's spoken sort of fondly for how Xi rules with an iron fist over China. And now, as you said, he's coming into office. Trump is at a time when he's expected to impose more tariffs on China, expected to sort of take a hard line on China as an adversary. So extending this invitation is sort of interesting and maybe sort of offering a bridge to maybe have more of a friendly relationship to see if they can avoid some of those harsher tactics. But certainly an interesting move that, as you said, I don't think any of us really expected that kind of invite.
So I want to switch gears a little bit. Jeff Bezos has announced a $1 million donation to Trump's inauguration fund. It matches Facebook parent company Meta's donation. Brett, how typical is this? It seems like Musk is the tech executive that's closest to Trump. In many ways, he's his right-hand man, seems to be spending an awful lot of time at Mar-a-Lago or wherever Trump is. So is this Bezos and Zuckerberg essentially trying to close that gap, prevent retribution, or maybe get closer to Trump, like Musk?
Yeah, Elon Musk maybe is a bit of a trendsetter in that sense. But certainly we've seen tech leaders like Mark Zuckerberg, like Jeff Bezos, Sam Altman, who's the head of OpenAI, recently announced that he personally was giving $1 million to the Trump inauguration committee, not through the company, but just from his own pocketbook. But so we're seeing certainly this trend of tech leaders and big tech folks trying to make inroads with Trump. I think it's sort of a combination of factors. Obviously, you mentioned retribution. Trump, really frequently sparred with Mark Zuckerberg and, attacked Facebook and accused them of all kinds of things during the 2020 election. It was very harsh with Mark Zuckerberg. Jeff Bezos, he obviously not only was critical of the Washington Post during his first term and beyond, but also when Trump was in office initially, his administration, Amazon actually sued because the Trump administration awarded this Pentagon contract to Microsoft instead of Amazon. And there were allegations that Trump did that because of personal bias against Amazon and Bezos. So there's these long running feuds. And now we see several years later that these folks are trying to maybe patch things up, both to maybe avoid retribution, but also potentially to sort of nudge policy in a more favorable direction. We've seen Bezos talk about, liking what Trump has talked about as far as cutting regulations. So certainly it is in their own personal interests to maybe build a warmer relationship with Trump, but it's also in their business interests to have a closer relationship with Trump.
It would make sense to definitely curry favor with the incoming administration, particularly when it comes to business in this case. Brett, as always, thank you.
Thanks, Julia.
Vice President-elect J.D. Vance has invited Daniel Penny, the Marine vet recently acquitted of negligent homicide in New York, to be his guest at the Army-Navy college football game this weekend. In a post on X, Vance wrote, "Daniel's a good guy, and a New York mob's district attorney tried to ruin his life for having a backbone." This comes after Penny was found not guilty on criminally negligent homicide charge in the chokehold death of Jordan Neely, a homeless man who had been yelling at passengers on a New York City subway train. Penny was originally charged with manslaughter in Neely's death. That count was dropped after the jury was deadlocked. Black Lives Matter activists protest the outcome, while Vance has remained openly supportive of Penny. Penny will reportedly join the game in a suite with Trump Defense Secretary nominee Pete Hegseth and other Trump picks. The annual Army-Navy game takes place in Landover, Maryland on Saturday. President-elect Trump is weighing in on the Federal Reserve, saying he won't try to get rid of Fed Chair Jerome Powell for now. The Fed Chair guides big decisions that have a major impact on interest rates Americans pay. In today's News Nation Political Minute, Blake Berman, host of The Hill on News Nation, breaks down how it works and where the Fed projects interest rates are headed.
The Fed chair stays for now. I'm Blake Berman, host of The Hill on News Nation. President-elect Donald Trump saying he won't try to get rid of Jay Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve. Now, that position is picked by the president and comes open again in Trump's second term. Now, here's why the Fed chair matters. The rates that Americans pay on loans like mortgages and car loans are often based on core interest rates set by the Fed. It's the rate that banks pay to borrow from each other overnight. Now, you can see here where each Fed decision maker thinks rates will be in the future. This year, it shows the Fed's rate at about 4.5% and going down next year, then below 3%, as you can see here, in 2026. Now, taking a look at rates right now, for example, the average rate for a new car loan is in the high 8% range. The average mortgage rate is in the high 6s. Now, the Fed's future decisions will play a big role in determining these rates. I'm Blake Berman, and this is the News Nation Political Minute.
And you can find more news and analysis from Blake and our colleagues 24/7 on News Nation. To find News Nation on your screen, go to joinnn.com. That's it for today's Daily Debrief. I'm Julia Manchester. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to The Hill's YouTube channel. And come back here soon for the intersection between politics and policy.